Hi guys. So today we're going to start on chapter 6. We're going to talk about files and exceptions. Primarily we're going to talk about files. Um, so we're going to have the sort of outline of our topics. So we're going to give an introduction to file input and output. We're going to talk about how to use loops to process files, how to process records, and we're going to talk about exceptions. And I know some of these things you don't know what they are, but we're going to define them all, so don't worry. Alright, for a program to retain data between the times it's run, you have to save the data. I think you all know this. You save Word documents, you save Excel files all the time. So the data is saved to a file, which is usually on your computer's disk. So saved data can be retrieved and used at a later time. Of course, like I said, we've all used files. We use files when we write programs. We use files all the time. There's a little bit of nomenclature. So we say writing data to when we mean saving data in a file. So if I say I'm going to write data to a file, that means I'm going to save the data that I have in memory in the program into the file. And another common term is the word is output file. So output file is a file that data is written to, as opposed to an input file, which is a file that data is written from. So let's look at writing data to a file. So here we have sort of a graphical representation of what our disk looks like, what our file looks like on the disk. So we have our data that's in memory. That's the stuff that's in our variables. So let's say, for example, we have 18.65 in a variable called pay rate. We have an employee ID, and we have an employee's name. So we want to save this in a file on the disk. And so what it's going to look like in the file is it's going to be sequential in the file. So we're going to save the name, we're going to save the employee ID, we're going to save the pay rate, and we're going to save that in the file. And when you look at the file, if you open the file, it's going to have name, employee ID, and pay rate in the file sequentially, one after the other. So the data comes from the RAM, and we store it in the file on the disk. And the way we do that is we put it sequentially in the allocated disk blocks. All right. So the opposite of writing to a file is reading data from. So reading data from a file is a process of retrieving the data that's been saved in a file and loading it into memory. So if we want to do something with the data in a program, remember it has to be in memory. We can't do things with data that are in files. We have to read them to memory first, make our changes, and if we want to save it, we have to write back out to the file. So an input file is a file from which data is read. So when we want to use files, there's three steps that we're always going to use. These are the same three things every single time. We're going to open the file. We're going to process the file. When we say process the file, we mean either read from the file or we're going to write to the file. Okay, depending on which one, or both. It could be both. And then we're going to close the file. So you can almost just cut and paste these things. You're always going to open the file, you're going to process, which means read or write, and you're going to close. Those are the three steps for file input output. They're always the three steps. They never change. It's exactly like this every single time. Open the file, process the file, close the file. All right. So here we have a pictorial uh, a pictorial representation of the file on disk again. In this case, we're going to read from the file into the variable. So we have these variables, name, ID, rate. We're going to read from the file that's on the disk, and we're going to store these things in the variables. So remember, when you write, it's going to go from variables to files. When you're reading, it's going to go from files to variables. We can't process data that's in the file directly. We have to load it into a variable, make our changes, and then write it back out to the file. Okay. So in general, there are two types of files. There are text files that contain data that's been encoded as text, and there are binary files that contain data that has not been converted to text. So if you think about it, actually all the files are binary. It really just depends on the encoding that we use. They're all actually in binary. Remember, everything in the computer is in binary. All the files are in binary. The difference is this. If you save your data in a text file and you open it up in Notepad, you can see it. It'll have, like the character's expecting. Like our early example is going to have the name. It's going to be readable by you. It's going to have a name. It's going to have pay rate, employee ID. If we save it in a binary file, when you load these things, they will generally not be readable. It'll look just like garbage. It'll look just like the scrambled up stuff. The same data can be in there, but it will just not be in a text format. It's really just how you encode the data that you write it out. As a binary, we just dump it straight from memory. And in text, so example, we know integers and strings are different, right? So if I have the string 1, 2, 3, it's 3 characters: the character 1, the character 2, the character 3. If I have the number 1, 2, 3, the binary number 1, 2, 3, it's just 32 bits of data that represent a number that we can add and subtract to. So if we wanted to write a number to data in binary, we could just write those 32 bits straight out to the file, right? We don't encode them as text. We just write 32 bits right out to file. And that, when you open it in Word, will just look like garbage. It'll just look like trash because it's 32 bits. It's not encoded as text. WordPad can't read it. Notepad can't read it. Nothing can read it. It just looks like trash, basically. It's not trash. It's 1, 2, 3, but it is encoded as binary. So if we want to have it readable by a human, what we have to do is we have to take that 1, 2, 3 and then re-encode it as text, as a string, and then write the string out. So you remember when we were working with string variables, when somebody types, like their a number in string in an input statement, that the first thing we have to do is we have to convert that to an int, right? So we take it from a string to an integer variable, which is a binary variable. But when we want to write it out to a file, we have to go the opposite way. So if we've done some arithmetic on an integer and want to write it out to the file and want it to be readable, which a lot of times we do, we need to convert that int from an integer, from a binary integer, to a string that looks like that binary integer, right? The series of characters that are stored in that binary integer, and those two are different things. All right, so that's the difference between text and binary. So there's 2 ways to access the data stored in a file. The first is sequential access, meaning that we can read sequentially from beginning to end and we can't skip ahead. And there's also direct access, where we can jump around to any piece of data in the file. So in one, you start from front and you work to back, and then in the other, we can jump around to any piece of data in the file and access any piece of data. So those are the 2 different ways that we can access data stored in files. We'll talk about how to do this in a little bit. So I think that's going to be it for this first video, and I will record the follow-up.